If you walk through this place on a weekday afternoon, it feels normal at first. The houses are still there. The roads still work. The lights still turn on. But look closer and something feels off. The shops close earlier than they used to. The bus comes less often. The school has fewer pupils. The pub shut last year. No one made a big announcement. No one rang an alarm bell. People just stopped being here. And the strange thing is, almost no one is talking about it. This isn't a ghost town. It's something quieter and more unsettling. It's a place that's still alive, but slowly emptying out. People aren't leaving in a rush. They're leaving one decision at a time. A job offer somewhere else. A rent increase that doesn't make sense. A commute that turns into 2 hours each way. A service that disappears and never comes back. And when enough people make those choices, a place changes shape without anyone noticing the moment it happened. This video isn't about blaming people for leaving. It's about understanding why staying stopped working. Because what's happening here isn't unique. It's happening in pockets across Britain. Coastal towns, former industrial areas, small communities that once held themselves together with work, routine, and shared life. Places that didn't collapse, but quietly slipped out of the national conversation. The uncomfortable truth is this: abandonment in Britain doesn't look dramatic. It looks ordinary. It looks like adaptation. It looks like people coping. And that's why it's so easy to miss. When something breaks slowly enough, it starts to feel normal. You don't notice the loss all at once. You notice it when you realize there's no reason left to stay. In this video, we're going to talk about why parts of Britain are being abandoned, not because they failed, but because the systems around them changed. We'll look at who leaves first, who gets left behind, and why the silence around this issue is almost as damaging as the decline itself. This isn't a story about the past. It's a story about what's happening right now, quietly, while the rest of the country looks elsewhere. Abandonment doesn't arrive with boarded-up buildings and warning signs. It doesn't announce itself. In Britain, abandonment looks subtle. It looks like things still working, just not as well as they used to. It looks like a place that technically functions, but feels thinner, quieter, and more fragile every year. It starts with small absences. A shop that used to open 6 days a week now opens 4. The post office shortens its hours. The bank branch closes, replaced by a sign telling people to use an app or travel to the next town. None of these changes feel dramatic on their own. People adjust. They always do, but each adjustment removes a little more reason to stay local. High streets are usually the first place you can see it clearly. Not empty, but uneven. A few businesses hanging on, surrounded by charity shops, vape stores, betting shops, and places that come and go every few months. The kind of shops that don't put down roots because they know the foot traffic isn't stable. When a town loses everyday businesses, the butcher, the hardware shop, the small cafe, it loses more than convenience. It loses routine. It loses reasons for people to bump into each other, talk, linger. Life becomes something you pass through, not something you gather around. Public transport is another giveaway. Buses still run, but less often. Routes get merged. Evening services disappear first, then weekends. Trains stop at fewer stations. If you don't drive, your world quietly shrinks. Getting to work becomes harder. Visiting family takes longer. Young people feel it most, but older residents feel it too, especially when they start to lose independence. Again, no single cut causes outrage. People rearrange their lives. But the message is clear: this place matters less than it used to. Schools tell a similar story. Class sizes shrink, not because education has improved, but because families are leaving or not arriving in the first place. Sometimes a school closes entirely, forcing children to travel further. That makes the area less attractive to new families, which pushes more people away. It's a loop that feeds itself. Once a town stops being a place where people raise children, its future becomes much harder to rebuild. Healthcare doesn't vanish overnight either. A GP surgery struggles to recruit doctors. Appointments take longer to get. Clinics reduce services. Hospitals centralize care in larger towns or cities. On paper, nothing is gone. In reality, access is worse, stress is higher, and people feel less supported. When something goes wrong, help feels further away than it should be. Housing gives another clue. You'll see homes that don't quite move. Not derelict, but stuck. Prices don't rise, but they don't fall enough to attract new demand either. People who want to leave struggle to sell. People who might move in hesitate because jobs are scarce and services feel uncertain. The area becomes a trap for some and a non-option for others. That kind of stagnation doesn't show up in dramatic headlines, but it changes how people think about their future. Then there's the atmosphere, which is harder to measure but easy to feel. Streets are quieter during the day because working-age people are commuting elsewhere or have already left. Evenings feel subdued. Events that used to bring people together, markets, fairs, local clubs, happen less often or stop altogether because organizers burn out or can't get enough volunteers. Community life thins, not because people don't care, but because they're stretched. What makes this form of abandonment so hard to confront is that nothing is obviously wrong enough to demand urgent action. There's no single closure that sparks national attention, no disaster footage, no clear moment where a place is declared lost. Instead, there's a long period where people sense decline but can't quite name it. They feel it when they have to travel further for basics, when their children say they don't plan to stay, when neighbors move away and aren't replaced. And crucially, many of the people still living in these places don't describe themselves as abandoned. They describe themselves as managing, coping and getting by. That language matters, because it normalizes the situation. When coping becomes the goal, improvement stops being expected. Abandonment in Britain is rarely about buildings falling down. It's about attention pulling away, investment drifting elsewhere, decision makers assuming that people will adapt, as they always have. And they do, until adapting quietly turns into leaving. Not all at once, not dramatically, just enough, year after year, for a place to lose its weight in the country's future. This is what abandonment actually looks like. Not absence, but erosion. Not collapse, but thinning. A slow process that feels survivable at every step, right up until the moment when staying no longer makes sense, and leaving feels like the only rational choice. When people talk about places being abandoned, it's easy to imagine everyone leaving at once. That isn't how it happens. What really defines these areas is the split between those who can leave and those who can't. That divide shapes everything about how decline unfolds, and it explains why abandonment feels so quiet. The first group to leave is almost always the young, not because they dislike where they grew up, but because staying closes doors. Jobs are limited. Wages are lower. Training and opportunities are concentrated elsewhere. When young people finish school or college, they look around and see few paths forward. So they go to cities, to larger towns and to anywhere that offers choice. They don't leave angrily. They leave practically, and many fully expect to come back one day. But once enough young people leave, the reason to return weakens. Friends scatter, jobs don't improve, services shrink. Over time, going back stops feeling like an option and starts feeling like a step backwards. The place they came from becomes somewhere they visit, not somewhere they rebuild their lives. Working-age adults with options are next. People with skills that travel. People who can drive long distances. People who can afford to move. At first, they stay and commute. Long journeys become normal. 2 hours each way is framed as temporary, but commuting drains time, energy, and money. Eventually, moving closer to work makes more sense than holding onto a place that no longer supports daily life. When they leave, they take spending power, social energy, and local involvement with them. What's left behind is a population that's older, poorer, and more rooted, not by choice, but by circumstance. Older residents often have deep ties to the area. Their homes are paid off or affordable. Their support networks are local. Moving would mean losing doctors, neighbors, and familiarity. For many, leaving isn't just difficult, it's unthinkable. Then there are those who are stuck because of housing. People who bought at the wrong time. People whose homes lost value. People whose properties won't sell. They're not staying because they want to. They're staying because they can't leave without taking a loss they can't afford. That kind of trap creates quiet resentment and long-term stress. It also freezes movement, making renewal even harder. Low-income workers feel the pressure differently. Jobs that remain are often lower paid and insecure. Transport cuts make commuting harder. Rising costs hit harder when wages don't move. Leaving requires savings, deposits, and flexibility that many simply don't have. So they stay, adapting to shrinking services and longer distances, carrying the full weight of decline. This creates a demographic imbalance. Fewer young people, fewer families, More elderly residents. That shift affects everything. Schools close. Youth services disappear. Care demand rises. Local economies tilt toward survival rather than growth. The place becomes less attractive to outsiders, which accelerates the cycle. What makes this especially painful is that many of the people who stay care deeply about their towns. They volunteer. They look after neighbors. They keep things going, but they're doing it with fewer resources, less support, and little sense that anyone outside the area is paying attention. Over time, that effort turns into exhaustion. There's also a silence that grows around staying. Leaving is often framed as success. Staying is framed as failure or lack of ambition. That stigma makes people less likely to speak openly about what's happening. They don't want to sound bitter or left behind. So decline becomes something felt privately rather than discussed publicly. This is how abandonment deepens without headlines. Those who can leave, do. Those who can't, stay and cope. The gap between the two widens. And as that gap grows, the chance of recovery shrinks. Not because people are lazy or resistant to change, but because the human foundation that allows places to renew themselves has been thinned out. Abandonment isn't just about empty buildings. It's about uneven exits. And once a place reaches that stage, reversing the process becomes far harder than stopping it in the first place. To understand why parts of Britain are being abandoned, you have to zoom out. What's happening now didn't start recently, and it didn't start because people suddenly stopped caring about their towns. It's the result of long-term political and economic choices that slowly reshaped where opportunity lives and who benefits from it. These places weren't forgotten by accident. They were deprioritized over decades. It begins with deindustrialization. Large parts of Britain were built around industries that provided stable, local work, manufacturing, mining, shipbuilding, steel, ports. These jobs didn't just provide wages. They anchored communities. They supported local shops, schools, transport, and identity. When those industries declined or were closed, whole areas lost their economic spine almost overnight. But the recovery that was promised never truly arrived in many of these places. Instead of replacing lost industries with new local employment, Britain shifted toward a service-based economy concentrated in cities. Finance, tech, professional services, and higher education clustered around London and a handful of urban centres. Growth became geographically uneven. Some places surged ahead. Others stalled. The assumption was that people would move to opportunity rather than opportunity being rebuilt where people already lived. At the same time, regional investment fell behind. Infrastructure spending, transport upgrades, cultural funding, and job creation were increasingly centralised. Decisions were made far from the places they affected. When budgets tightened, smaller towns were often the first to lose out. Transport routes were cut. Local services were merged or removed. Each decision made sense on paper. Together, they hollowed out everyday life. Housing policy added another layer. Britain failed to build enough homes where people actually needed them, while allowing property to become an investment rather than just shelter. In places with declining economies, homes lost value and became traps. In growing areas, prices exploded, pushing workers further out. The system didn't encourage balanced development. It rewarded scarcity and concentration. Local government also changed. Councils were given more responsibility but fewer resources. As funding was reduced, councils had to choose what to cut. Libraries, youth centres, leisure facilities, and local support services often went first. These weren't seen as essential in national terms, but they were essential to community life. Their loss made places feel emptier and less supported. Political attention followed votes and visibility. Areas that lost population and influence struggled to be heard. Without strong media coverage or economic leverage, decline stayed quiet. National conversations focused on growth, innovation, and global competitiveness, not on places slowly slipping backward. When decline isn't dramatic, it's easy to ignore. Crucially, none of this felt coordinated to the people living through it. There was no single policy that said, "This town will be left behind." Instead, there were many small decisions that nudged resources elsewhere. Each one seemed manageable. Each one pushed places a little further from the center of national life. Over time, these areas adapted. People commuted. Families adjusted expectations. Communities coped. That coping masked the scale of the problem. Because people didn't protest en masse, it looked like the system was working. In reality, individuals were absorbing the cost of structural neglect. This history matters because it shows that abandonment isn't about failure at a local level. It's about priorities at a national one. When growth is allowed to cluster and decline is treated as acceptable collateral, some places are always going to be left behind. What's happening now is the long echo of those choices. And until that context is acknowledged, abandonment will continue to look like a personal decision instead of what it really is, the predictable outcome of decades of uneven attention and investment. One of the strangest parts of this story is how little it's talked about. Not because it isn't happening, but because it doesn't fit the way Britain usually discusses decline. There are no dramatic moments, no sudden collapse, no clear villain. What's happening to these places is slow, quiet, and spread out, and that makes it easy to ignore. First, abandonment doesn't look like a crisis on the surface. The streets aren't empty, the houses aren't falling down. Shops still open, even if fewer than before. Buses still run, even if less often. From the outside, everything looks fine enough. And in politics and media, fine enough rarely triggers attention. Headlines chase shocks, not slow erosion. There's also a language problem. We don't really have words for this kind of decline. Calling a place abandoned sounds extreme, even insulting, especially to the people who still live there. So the conversation avoids it. Instead, we talk about challenges, transition, or adjustment. Those words soften what's happening and make it sound temporary or manageable. When language downplays reality, urgency disappears. Many of the people living through this don't talk about it either. There's a quiet pride in coping. Admitting that your town is being left behind can feel like admitting failure, even when it isn't your fault. People don't want to sound negative about where they live. They don't want to confirm stereotypes. So they keep going, making the best of things, even as life gets harder. Leaving is often framed as success. Staying is framed as settling. That framing silences those who remain. If speaking up risks being seen as bitter or resistant to change, people stay quiet. They adapt privately instead of organizing publicly. And without visible anger or protest, it's easy for outsiders to assume everything is fine. There's also the issue of scale. Abandonment happens in many places, but each one feels small on its own. One town losing a bus route doesn't make national news. One high street struggling isn't unusual, but when dozens of places experience the same slow decline at once, it adds up to a national problem. Because it's spread out, it never fully comes into focus. Media attention plays a role too. Coverage tends to follow growth, controversy, or visible crisis. Decline that unfolds over years doesn't fit well into short news cycles. It's hard to show on camera. It doesn't provide clear moments of drama, so it's reported occasionally, then forgotten. Without sustained attention, the issue slips back into the background. Politics reinforces the silence. Admitting that large parts of the country are being quietly left behind raises uncomfortable questions. About investment, about priorities, about whether the current model of growth actually works for everyone. Those questions don't have easy answers, and they challenge the idea that progress is evenly shared. It's often easier to talk about national averages than regional realities. Even policy language contributes to the quiet. Terms like leveling up sound hopeful, but they often lack clear measures or timelines. They suggest improvement without acknowledging how deep the gap already is. When promises are vague, disappointment becomes normal. People stop expecting change and stop demanding it. The final reason this goes unspoken is that people adapt so well. Humans are incredibly good at adjusting to worse conditions if they happen slowly enough. Longer commutes become routine. Fewer services become accepted. Lower expectations become normal. By the time people realize how much has changed, it feels too late to name it. This silence is dangerous because it allows abandonment to continue without challenge. When something isn't talked about, it isn't planned for, funded, or fixed, it becomes invisible, even to those living inside it. And perhaps the hardest truth is this: the quieter the decline, the easier it is for the rest of the country to look away. When a place is left behind, it doesn't fall apart all at once. It settles into a slower, heavier version of itself. The consequences show up gradually, spreading through everyday life in ways that feel disconnected at first, but are deeply linked. Over time, the cost of being left behind stops being abstract and starts shaping how people live, work, and think about their future. One of the first things to change is the local economy. With fewer people and less spending power, businesses struggle to survive. Shops close, cafes shut their doors. Employers find it harder to recruit. Jobs become more insecure and often lower paid. Those who still work locally carry more pressure, covering extra shifts or taking on multiple roles. Work stops being a source of stability and becomes something you endure. Public services feel the strain next. Schools lose funding as pupil numbers drop. Healthcare becomes harder to access as facilities centralize elsewhere. Social care stretches thinner. Transport routes are cut or reduced because they're no longer profitable. Each service loss makes daily life harder, which pushes more people to consider leaving, feeding the cycle. Housing becomes a trap. Property values stagnate or fall, making it difficult for residents to move even if they want to. Renting can become unstable as landlords withdraw or neglect properties. Empty homes appear, but they aren't a solution, they signal decline. When housing stops being a foundation for life and turns into a barrier, people lose confidence in the future. Community life weakens. With fewer people and less time, social activities fade, clubs close, events stop running, volunteering becomes harder as the same small group of people are asked to do more. Isolation grows, especially among older residents. People still care, but care alone can't replace infrastructure. The psychological impact is often overlooked. Living in a place that feels forgotten changes how people see themselves. Pride turns into defensiveness. Hope becomes cautious. Young people feel torn between loyalty and opportunity. Those who stay may feel judged or invisible. Over time, this creates frustration and quiet anger, not always directed outward, but often turned inward. Crime and antisocial behavior can rise, not because people become worse, but because opportunity disappears. Boredom, stress, and lack of support create conditions where problems grow. Policing becomes harder with fewer resources. Trust erodes. The sense that this place is going somewhere fades. Perhaps most damaging is how decline limits choice. When options shrink, life becomes narrower. People take jobs they don't want because there's nothing else. They stay in housing that doesn't suit them. They delay plans indefinitely. A place left behind doesn't just lose people, it loses possibility. And yet, through all of this, life continues. People raise families. They look after neighbors. They find moments of joy. That resilience is real, but it shouldn't be mistaken for success. Coping is not the same as thriving. When a place is left behind, the damage isn't just economic. It's emotional, social, and generational. Children grow up with fewer opportunities. Older residents face isolation. The gap between regions widens, hardening into something that feels permanent. This is what happens when abandonment goes unchecked. Not collapse, but slow suffocation. And once a place reaches this stage, reversing course becomes far harder, not because people don't care, but because so much of the foundation has already been worn away. If nothing changes, this doesn't end with empty streets and closed shops. It settles into something much quieter and much harder to reverse. A slow future where these places don't disappear, but never truly recover either. They become areas that exist, but don't progress. Places where life continues, but opportunity doesn't return. In that future, the gap between different parts of Britain becomes permanent. Not just richer and poorer, but moving and stuck. Some places grow, attract investment, and pull people in. Others are left managing decline as a long-term condition. Once that divide hardens, it stops being a phase and starts being a structure. Children born in these places inherit fewer choices before they've even had a chance to decide who they want to be. Work becomes thinner and more fragile. Local jobs remain scarce and insecure. Commuting becomes the only option for those who can manage it, draining time and energy every day. For those who can't, work options shrink further. Wages stay low because people have little bargaining power. Over time, effort and reward drift further apart, and motivation fades. Housing locks people in place. Properties don't gain value, so moving means taking losses many can't afford. Empty homes increase, but not in a way that attracts renewal. They become symbols of stagnation. The area stops being seen as somewhere to build a future and becomes somewhere people try to escape from, if they can. Public services continue to thin out. Fewer schools, fewer health facilities, longer travel times for basic care. The people who remain rely more on support while having less access to it. Local government struggles to maintain even essential services. The sense that the system is there for you weakens year after year. Community life shrinks further, not because people stop caring, but because caring alone can't replace resources. The same people are asked to volunteer again and again. Burnout spreads, isolation deepens, loneliness becomes normal, especially among older residents. Younger people who stay feel invisible and frustrated. Trust, in institutions, in fairness, in the future, erodes quietly. The most dangerous part of this future isn't anger. It's acceptance. When people stop expecting improvement, they stop demanding it. Decline becomes background noise. Politics becomes distant. Hope becomes something you feel embarrassed to express. At that point, abandonment is complete, not because a place is empty, but because belief has drained away. This matters because it doesn't stay contained. A country with large areas left behind becomes less stable, less cohesive, and less confident. Pressure builds elsewhere as cities absorb more demand. Tension grows between regions. The idea of a shared future weakens. Britain becomes a collection of very different realities living side by side, barely connected. And none of this happens suddenly. That's why it's so dangerous. Every step feels survivable. Every year feels manageable, until one day, recovery feels impossible, not because people didn't care, but because too much time passed without attention. This video isn't about blaming communities or individuals. The people living in these places didn't fail. They adapted. They coped. They stayed when staying got hard. The real failure is allowing quiet abandonment to become normal, because once a place is truly left behind, rebuilding it takes far more than investment. It takes restoring trust, opportunity, and belief, and those are much harder to replace once they're gone. If you want to understand how other parts of Britain are reaching this same point, watch the next video.